Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Law of the Empire. I'm your host, Reina, and today's episode is super interesting because we're joined with Ga Eun Cho, who is a PhD student at Johns Hopkins, and she is specifically focusing on South Korea's migration policies during the 1960s and 1970s. She has a lot of knowledge and she's super educated, so this episode's going to be super interesting and exciting. During this episode, she talks about South Korea's migration policy, the effect this had on families and individuals, why this policy came to be, the motivations behind the government implementing this policy, and she also recommends some books to high schoolers and college students interested in this topic. So, without further ado, here she is. So, hi, could you tell me about yourself, your research, and what you're currently working on right now?
Hello, my name is Ga Eun Cho. It's pronounced how you would pronounce Gaon, Gown, but not spelled that way. Um, I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. At Johns Hopkins University, I'm also a graduate student fellow at the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism. So I'm working on my dissertation, which is, I guess, the final project of a PhD program, which is titled Rethinking Migration, and the subtitle is The Politics of Immigration in South Korea. And this dissertation looks at economic development or policies that encourage economic growth from the perspective of, or through the focus of the movement of people across borders, so migration. In other words, I specifically study why countries encourage or force people to go out of their country to a different country for the sake of economic development of that country.
That's really
So the reason I am thinking about this is because when countries talk about development, growth, or progress, we often think about building factories, building roads, and increasing the GDP generally. That is the I guess the definition of economic development. But I also show that when governments are actually thinking about how to achieve this economic development that we can see, they're actually making decisions about who belongs and who doesn't belong in the country. The people that get sent away, at least in the case of South Korea in the 1960s and 70s, were often poor or from like rural areas, were biracial in South Korea, which was a problem for South Koreans, or had disabilities or didn't have family members. They could also be like politically troublesome and generally just did not fit the idea of a perfect citizen for the government. So that's what I'm interested in studying.
that's really interesting. So, is there a specific time period your research looks at in South Korea, or is it just like all over?
So I'm looking at the beginning to end of policy of the South Korean government sending out people. The policy name is well, like mass emigration. So emigration or going out of the country in massive numbers that is led by the state.
Mhm.
And this policy began in the 1960s and sort of died out in the mid 1970s, depending on which policy.
Mhm.
But so like the thing with migration or movement of people is that people don't disappear once they go out of the border, right? So they might be recruited and be sent out of the country in the 1960s and 1970s, but that means when like in the 1980s, 1990s, they're still in those other countries or they may have moved to another country. Um, and then in the and later 1990s, 2000s, and even recently, they might decide to come back to South Korea as return migrants. So I'm looking at the beginning to the end of the migration policy. So even beyond it, the actual policies ending in the 1970s, who gets to come back to South Korea and who doesn't, when do they come back and why? Um, so yeah, so
So,
it's beginning in the 60s and
mhm.
until the contemporary period.
Okay, got it. So, what kind of factors have you noticed that influence people coming back, and what kind of like people does the government allow to come back in?
That's a good question because it's also what I'm studying in South Korea right now as a fellow at Seoul National University. What I am seeing is that depending on which policy that you migrated out of the country in the first place impacts whether or when you decide to come back to South Korea and for how long. So the three policies I'm comparing are transnational adoption of Korean children or babies, and the second is labor migration or work migration programs to as nurses and minors to West Germany,
Hmm.
now Germany. And the last one is agricultural migration in groups of families to South America, especially Brazil.
Hmm.
And these three policies are different policies, but by the same government, by the same period. And what I'm seeing is that if you were, for instance, a nurse in the 1960s who was sent to Germany to work, you would likely come back right after your 3-year program. That was the contract. So after 3 years, you'll come back to South Korea, maybe you'll get married. If you did not come back in the 3 years, you would actually stay much longer. So either 3 years or 30, 40 years. And after 40 years, the South Korean government recognized that these nurses and miners contributed economically to South Korea's development, and now they have laws that respect and acknowledge that contribution. So you could get like a better rate on, for instance, bank loans if you want to settle back in Korea. However, if you are an adoptee who was sent not by your choice because you wouldn't know that you are going to another country necessarily when you're a baby. So if you're an adoptee sent in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there is no such acknowledgement until very recently. I'm saying like this, I think this April when the government issued an apology. Like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission acknowledged that there have been many malpractices in the adoption policies. So instead of that kind of recognition and like valorization, heroization, heroic like storytelling of the nurses and miners, instead you were given, I guess, kind of a treatment that acknowledges that you were sent out of the country um not by your own choice, but not as strong or as structural support for coming back to South Korea. So the South Korean government would offer, for instance, a week-long trip back to South Korea to do some tourism, to see how the country developed, maybe find your family if you don't have connections to your birth family, but not in the same length or the same, I guess, economic, um, what would be the word? Economic grievance procedure that the nurses and miners were given in South Korea. That was a long answer.
That was really interesting, though. So, with the nurses coming back or choosing not to come back, is it like their decision whether they can come back, or are they just like not let into the country in some situations and they have to wait those 30 years before they can come back? Like, why is there
Well,
such a broad range between 30 and 30 years?
so there is no official statistics of
Mhm.
like who came back when, but the the scholars and people who are sorry, who are researching about nurses and minors or nurses and minors themselves, they they think about 2/3 of the people who are contracted to go to West Germany came back right after. So about 2/3, they saw the contract of 3 years, they worked for 3 years, very hard work, and then they were like, okay, maybe I'll go back.
Mhm.
Because that's when their visa is supposed to end.
Okay.
But then there were other about 20%, so about like a bit less than 1/3 who were like, oh, like I like staying abroad for whatever reason.
Mhm.
South Korea was economically still developing. It was after the Korean War, so they decided maybe we want this out of country life.
Mhm.
Um, but because their visa ended in West Germany, they couldn't stay in Germany. So they moved to another country, maybe like France, the US, or maybe even Brazil. So we call them we call it remigration. But then there's this other less than 10% of people who decided to settle in West Germany because maybe they got married to each other, they had a child, they went, they finished their contract and they went to school. They went to university to get more education or maybe even grad school. Or in the case of nurses, they could stay practically as long as they liked because the hospitals actually preferred them to stay after their contract because 3 years for a nurse is just training. So it was actually more useful for the hospitals for the nurses to stay. So the nurses could stay longer and then a lot of them would get married to a minor, so that would give them spousal visas for the minors. So yeah, so that would be like the rough distribution. So 60% came straight back,
Mhm.
30% or like 25% went to another country, and then the remaining 5 to 10% decided to stay in West Germany or and then later Germany. But then at the end of their lives
Mhm.
or after they retired, they may have decided, some of them decide, oh, maybe I want to go back to my home country where I lived for the first 25 years of my life. That's where I want to retire to. I want to be with my family. I want to speak my own language. I want Korean food. So I think that's how decisions were being made to when or whether they want to come back to South Korea.
Okay, got it. So it wasn't like they were forced to stay out. It was like their own choice on whether they wanted to come back or whether they wanted to move somewhere else or stay in West Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, so then for you said in April this year that the government of South Korea like issued an apology to the adoptees who were forced to move out of the country when they were babies, probably, right?
hmm
So why did the government issue this apology and what was their motivation behind issuing said apology?
So between 1960, when this official adoption program started, and until 1990, about, let me get the number right, about 200,000 children were adopted from South Korea. And this is a big number.
Mhm.
Like until the early 2000s, Korea was the number one sender of transnational adoptions. And there's so in the beginning, when I talked about the thing about moving people is that they're people and not just things that disappear once they move out of the country. So adoptees themselves grow up and become adults and become members of the society. And they a lot of and pretty often they want to learn about why they are different from their families or why they're in like rural Scotland and not in Seoul when everyone else around them could be is usually white Scottish people,
Mhm.
for instance, in the case of Scotland. Um, and they grew up, and a lot of them discovered or tried to discover um, the why they were adopted, who their birth family was,
Mhm.
why they were adopted to this country, or like who went through the process of fostering them, and then sending them as international adoptees, right? But then a lot of them discovered in the process that their documents, their official documents provided by the adoption agency isn't correct. So they were falsified. They don't, maybe by the adoption agency, maybe by the person who was giving them away, maybe by the receiving adoption agency, but their name would be different, their birthday would be different. They maybe some of them were switched to another baby who was actually an orphan, but um, some of them even discovered that they were just lost. And an adoption agency or someone looking for commission from the adoption agency would scoop them up from the streets and then make them fake them as being adoptable and send them away to other countries. And this has become a problem because there's, as I said, a lot of adoptees from South Korea, right? And adoptions from South Korea is becoming less and less, but there's still a lot of international adoptions from like China or from other countries. So it's still a practice that's still going on. And a lot of adoptees in each country and now internationally created like activist what do you call it? Communities. So adoptee communities that is strong on transitional justice and discovering the truth about the circumstances of adoption. So a few years ago, I think this was led by the adoptee organization in Denmark, if I'm not wrong. So those adoptee organizations um, requested the South Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission to assess the circumstances of these adoption practices. And after a few years of investigation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission decided, or what do you say, announced? No, discovered, officially announced that some of the claims that were made by the adoptee organizations are true, that some adoption agencies indeed falsified the records, and the government indeed looked over such bad practices. So that's why in April or May, when this was officially completed, the investigation was officially completed, um, like what would I say? The people had access to this information, and were given now an official statement that the circumstances were false or could have been false, and that they could look for compensation in the future.
Okay, got it. That's really interesting. So when these migration policies were implemented and in place in the 1960s and 1970s, what was the government trying to do with these policies in the first place?
So officially, what the government was saying to the press or to the people was that there is a huge problem of overpopulation in South Korea in the 1960s. So this is after the Korean War. Korea was devastated, but then because the war was over and Korea was still an agricultural country that was trying to transition to an industrial country, the birth rate was really high. I'm saying a parent would have six or seven or even eight children because they needed them for farm labor. But the government saw this was a problem because this is not sustainable. If every parent has six or seven children, then we're still poor. We will not have enough food to eat. This would be a structural problem. So the government is trying to tackle overpopulation by, well, in a lot of ways. They're trying like um, fertility control. They're trying like education of potential mothers.
Mhm,
But they're also saying, well, like there are already a lot of people. Let's get them out of the country.
mhm,
That's that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is that not everyone was targeted, or not everyone was even allowed to go outside of the country. It was the same period when there were really strict passport laws. So meaning you could only get a passport for very specific reasons, and the government could deny you a passport. That was the default, right? But then, so when the default was you're not allowed to go out of the country, and only select groups of people were encouraged to go out of the country, you can suspect that there's something common about the people who are being pushed out of the country. And I think that's because they're they weren't seen as people or groups of people who are contributing to this new idea of this industrializing country. So adoptees were being seen as like extra burden for the country in terms of social welfare, but also in terms of them being not ideal type of Korean children the government wants in this industrial future. Um, so those other, so more of, I think there's more of a consideration of who belongs in the country and who doesn't. than just saying, oh, we need to reduce numbers, anyone can go out, because that was not the case because of the passport law.
Okay. Kind of like controlling what their ideal citizen looked like and really pushing that image throughout the country. So why did South Korea opt to do migration policies as opposed to like let's say, for example, like China's one-child policy they had to control population?
Right, so it wasn't that South Korea didn't have very strong birth control
Hmm.
policies as well. It wasn't as forced as strongly, I guess, deterred as China's case, but South Korea did also have a lot of propaganda, very like interesting ways to having phrase that having ba less babies is better. Um, South Korean government also received a lot of money and support from Western countries like Sweden to have IUD surgeries. I don't know if you know what that means, but it's basically um, like mini surgeries to have women um, unable to have any more babies, let's say. So like contraception that's
Hmm.
through surgery.
Yeah.
Um, there's also so like there's records of or not records. There have been like those mini vans, cars
Hmm.
where they have in the back in the trunk of the vans the IUD surgery equipment, and they would go around the rural areas to do this operation on women with their consent, but the way the consent was acquired might be a bit questionable because they were less educated and
Hmm.
etc. So there were other ways of controlling the number of babies being born that was in the process as well, and that was also like a huge number and very successful in terms of the the birth rate declining. But at the same time, there were also measures to have people who are already exist in the country who are not babies go out of the country as well.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So how did these migration policies affect people's lives in ways beyond just money or jobs?
Um, do you mean for people who go out or people who are remaining?
People who go out, like for example, for the nurses who went out to pursue like nursing in West Germany.
Hmm. Um, well, it's definitely uh I don't want to sound cringy, but it's a life-changing
Mm.
experience
Yeah.
because as I said, Korea is devastated after the war. They're not a lot of people are not allowed to go out of the country, but you go to West Germany, right?
Mhm.
And these are very brave women and men in the first place
Mhm.
because they've lived in Korea for 20, 30 years. They usually have families in Korea, and they decide to leave all that behind, go to West Germany, um, a country they've never been before. There's not even a direct flight then, so they have to go to Japan and then Alaska and then blah blah blah. It's like 20 or
Mhm.
30 hours. Um, but the problem is once they experience this life
Mhm.
in West Germany for 3 or more years, they um they send a lot of money back to Korea. So like they
Mhm.
save all the money they get to send back to their families. Um, and then they sacrifice for their families
Mhm.
and for the sake of South Korean development. And then once they go back, it's an adjustment again because
Mhm.
they they didn't save up money themselves to go back to South Korea, so they have to work again to whatever. And if they're a lot of them get married back in South Korea as well, um but now let's say like their perspective is different because they experienced this life in West Germany where they were like the breadwinners of their family,
Mhm.
but now they're expected to come back to South Korea and become maybe housewives, and that could be a transition for them again.
Mhm.
Um, for people who are sent as farmers or agricultural migrants to South America, they're not it's much difficult to come back to South Korea because South America you couldn't even go by plane. You had to ride a steamboat for 1 month, learn Portuguese there, learn Spanish in the ship. And then you arrive in Brazil, in Paraguay, in Bolivia, and there and coming back is really, really difficult. Like, not a lot of people succeed in coming back because it's a lot of money you have to save in order to buy a fare back and go back to where, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you left all belongings, you sold all your properties because you decided to go to South America, where you don't know the language, you don't know anyone except for maybe the 100 people that you came with. So you're forced to adjust in a different culture, different climate, with different people, different language, and that's a transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it must be hard for like everyone to like go to a whole new place once and then adjust to that way of life and then have to come back to South Korea and adjust to South Korea's way of life all over again. That's like multiple
Mhm,
different cultures, like in just a span of a few years, which must be really tough on everyone.
for sure.
I think my last question for you is, do you have any books or podcasts or like news articles or anything you would recommend to high schoolers and college students who are interested in this issue?
Oh, that's a good question. I am not a huge podcast listener.
Mhm.
Oh, let me think. Nothing really comes up to mind at this point,
Mhm.
but Christina Klein's book, Cold War Orientalism,
Okay.
has a chapter on transnational adoptions where, so the premise of the book, if I'm not like vastly misconstruing
Mhm.
the book, is that this type of family making, ideal family making, viewing people in the East as, I guess, tools of the Cold War
Mhm.
is what led people in the West, especially the US, to pursue different types of policies, including adoption. And that inspired me when I was writing, researching about transnational adoption. So that could be an interesting book to read.
Mhm. That sounds really interesting. Thank you so much.
Of
This is
course.
really helpful. I learned so much, and I know everyone else did too. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's all give one big final thanks to Gown for coming on our podcast episode today. I know I learned a lot of information, and I hope that all of you guys did too. So that's it for this week's episode. And if you like this week's episode, be sure to follow us on Spotify and follow us on Instagram at Law of the Empire. We have new episodes coming out every other week on Wednesdays, so be sure not to miss one. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye!